afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us on the Taking the Grief Out of Grievance webinar today. My name is Jenny and I'm the Business Development Manager for the TCM Group. Today's webinar, we have the CEO of TCM, David Liddell, and our Senior Resolution Consultant, Elaine Smith. We are currently waiting for a few more people to join us as we are due to start at 12 o'clock, but we'll give them a few more minutes and then we'll be right with you with the webinar to go.
Thank you, Jenny. Good afternoon, everybody. A very, very warm welcome to this webinar today, Taking the Grief Out of Grievance, something which I know many HR professionals, employee relations professionals, industrial relations professionals and others, perhaps even some junior doctors are thinking about today, is how do we help people in a dispute, in a conflict, in a feud, in a battle, in a disagreement, finding those tough times in their workplace, find a satisfactory resolution. It goes by so many different names. On one level, we're talking about often low-level spats, disagreements, not seeing eye to eye. Something low-level, we wish our managers and leaders would get the two parties in a room, perhaps encouraging them to have a conversation, thrash it out, work it out, have a conversation, and walk back into their office, their distribution centre, their depot, happier, they've had a level of dialogue, they understand each other. And of course, many managers and leaders have those courageous and confident conversations. And for me, those managers and leaders are the unsung heroes of the organisation, helping to fix issues effectively and quickly. However, as we know, a great many managers and leaders don't have the confidence, they perhaps don't have the competence, they don't have the capacity to manage those kind of conversations, to nip issues in the bud. And unfortunately, what we see an escalation of the dispute. The language hardens, the parties become more polarised, the positions become more entrenched. The language becomes disagreement, grievance, bullying, harassment. And of course, it's at this point that the human resources team fly into the situation, try and find a remedy, bring the parties together and have a facilitated conversation. And in many cases, that's true. And in a great many organisations, that's exactly what HR do, working below the radar, bringing those parties together. However, what we sometimes see at this stage in the dispute is the terminology of grievance and bullying. These are procedural terms that are often used to precipitate a procedural response to the dispute. And what we know is once we get into process, the parties' positions become hardened further. It becomes much more difficult to resolve, and we start to see stress, anxiety, division within teams, dysfunction, lower productivity, lower performance. The challenges become much harder. So we begin to rely on our policies and our procedures to help us to manage the situation. And unwittingly and unknowingly, those policies and procedures which are there to assist the parties find a resolution, actually, paradoxically, are actually making matters worse and encouraging a level of escalation and continuous disagreement at a time where what we should be doing is putting the parties together in a room and helping them to find a solution, a mutually advantageous, beneficial, interest and needs-based outcome where they both walk away with greater insight and understanding. However, in the absence of that, the grievance process takes hold, the language becomes hardened, and of course, if we take it to its worst case scenario, we start to hear language of litigation, early conciliation, settlement agreements, payoffs, money, more time, more money, more time, more money, reputational impact, cost. And unfortunately, for a great many organisations, is at that stage of the conflict life cycle where the greatest amount of money, time and energy is invested. And what Elaine and I are going to be focusing on today is saying, yes, we understand the need to be able to address issues at that stage of the conflict. And of course, organisations need to be able to address issues when they become so severe. But surely there must be a better way. Surely there must be a way of encouraging those parties to come together at a much earlier stage and have a constructive and positive dialogue in order that they can find a satisfactory outcome. And today I'm going to be challenging some of the myths that exist around grievance. And for me, one of the biggest myths that exists around grievance is that the grievance procedure is a process of dispute resolution. I believe it's completely the opposite. My experience of grievance procedures is a procedure of dispute escalation. It's not about identifying the root cause of the issues. It's about delivering a perceived sense of procedural fairness for the protagonists in order that the employer can demonstrate reasonableness in an employment tribunal that has met the minimum standards of the ACAS Code on Discipline and Grievance. That's great in an employment tribunal. But what about helping our parties find a mutually beneficial outcome that delivers benefits for your business and helps you secure a competitive advantage for your business and helps them find a meaningful outcome? So today, I hope that we can challenge some of the misunderstandings around grievance and present to you, HR professionals, business leaders within your organisations, a new and innovative approach. It's not progressive, by the way. Someone said this to me, Elaine. It's a progressive approach. I said it's not progressive. Sitting in a room and talking to each other is the most basic human principle that we could have of how to resolve issues. It's the notion of a procedure which is progressive. We've only had them in place for 30 or 40 years. What they have done in the processes, I believe, is actually impeded common sense, and they've impeded a people-based or people-centred methodology to dispute resolution. We will, of course, explore that. So I'm David Little, and I've got my colleague here, Elaine Smith. It says Owen Bob is there, but it should say Elaine. Elaine, that's you looking at us there. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everyone. Like David said, I'm Elaine. I'm one of the senior resolution consultants here. My background is very much HR, and I still do some HR and very much enjoy it. And I think I can offer a bit of a different perspective, and maybe the perspective from an HR professional on this particular topic. I've been mediating as well, so I can see both sides of the coin very well and how they both work together so well. And from my experience, I think the major problem that people have is that they don't have the confidence to facilitate these conversations.
Yeah.
They don't have the right tools necessarily, and they're really worried that they might make things worse. And I think that's where the resistance to actually sometimes get people to sit down comes from. It's very old-fashioned. It's the way our parents and our grandparents did things. It's not moving with the times. Whereas actually it's such a natural and beneficial thing when you do actually get people to sit down together. But you need the confidence, you need the right tools to do that job.
Absolutely, and certainly thank you very much for those of you who filled in the survey as part of the webinar. And this is exactly what you're saying to us you want. You're wanting to have new and innovative approaches. Many of you are describing almost being overwhelmed by the number of grievances. You can see that the grievance process, you're telling us that the grievance process, in theory it should work, but what you were relaying to us is actually the practices that it's stressing people out and it's actually creating harm and dysfunction within teams. And I think I'm certainly, we've got over 85 people on today's webinar. It's very, very popular. This is a very popular topic because I think there's a recognition, Elaine, in what you're saying, that there's a lack of confidence in how to address these issues, and then maybe needs to be another way. So I'm David, I'm the CEO and the founder of the TCM group. My background is in non-violence and community cohesion, community engagement. That's where I began my work. And for the last 15 years, I've been working with organisations, big businesses to small micro companies, helping them to almost embed a culture of mediation, to be mediation friendly. One of my real passions is the recognition that just and fair outcomes can be delivered when we sit in a room and talk to each other. Just and fair outcomes don't have to be simply delivered by virtue of the two parties bringing their case in front of a higher authority in order to be able to have a determination reached. That's the model of justice that we've grown up with, that we're familiar with, and what mediation offers is another form of justice, which is you and I, the two parties in a dispute, know the answers to the problems that we're facing. We have the capacity to resolve it. So today's webinar will last around about 45 minutes. I hope you can hear me okay. My microphone levels are showing pretty high, but I have had a message, Ranjit, thank you for your message, just saying you're struggling to hear. I'm not sure how I could turn my mic up, if indeed I can, but it is showing that it's at a reasonable level here, so I hope you can hear me okay. Elaine will speak up nice and clearly for the webinar. It's being recorded and it will also be transcribed, and we'll post the recording onto our website, also our YouTube channel. The transcription will also then be posted as a white paper. There'll be opportunity, there's 2 polls through the webinar where you can interact with us and tell us a little bit about your experience of grievance processes and resolution approaches, and there's an opportunity for you to ask questions throughout. In fact, we've had Jessica, Emily and Judith, you've already asked us questions. Judith, you wanted to know if the recording would be available. Hopefully I've answered that one. And Emily, you want to know about the access code. Hopefully you're on. And have we started? I can't hear anything. Jessica, I hope you can hear us okay. We started a few minutes ago. Within many organisations now, they're starting to move away from the terminology of grievance procedure to resolution policy. Instead of taking out a grievance or threatening to take out a grievance against your colleague, they're now going to resolution. So let me give you an example. A large bank that we've been working with, their HR team now receive requests for resolution rather than grievance processes. And it's turned that bank on its head. It's turned dispute resolution on its head. It's about language. It's about how we construct our thinking. So today we'll be talking about the resolution policy, and we'll be sharing that resolution policy with everyone on this webinar so you can see the impact that it could have. Simply changing the title of the policy from grievance procedure to resolution policy can make a significant shift in mindset. Please enjoy the webinar. We'll be discussing some fantastically interesting topics. We're passionate about it and hope that you enjoy it. So a little bit about TCM. We've been around for 15 years. We help employees, leaders, teams and organisations to achieve their full potential by removing those barriers that are often generated by conflict, change and communication breakdown. We specialise in mediation services. We're all about mediation. We're about delivering mediation services, training people to deliver mediation and creating mediation-friendly cultures within organisations where this notion of justice, collaborative, cooperative justice, it plays an equal part to the notions of adversarial justice, and we'll talk more about that. We specialise in creating a self-sufficient programme, Elaine, where we go into organisations like Royal Mail Group, Transport for London, Marks and Spencer, BT, to name just a few, and going in and training internal mediators to deliver mediation services within the business. It's a fantastically effective model. Elaine, you're one of a team of mediators here at TCM, and we're accredited by Customer First, and we have various other quality standards that we work to. So what challenges will we face today, Elaine? Well, why are more organisations ditching this approach in favour of a resolution policy?
Well, I think it's because it's too old-fashioned. It's too old-fashioned and it clearly doesn't work. And I've looked at the survey that we sent out to people attending today, and I see a lot of people don't actually measure the impact of their grievance procedure, which I think is such a good business case that you can put forward to say possibly the way we have been doing things isn't working very well if only you started to actually measure the impact of that grievance procedure on your business. I think it will be very revealing to see the results that come from that. Whereas I find that where mediation actually works the most effectively is on management level as well, because they will see when there are issues within their team before anybody else does. Right. But I think a lot of people are starting to look at how other bigger organisations such as Marks and Spencer's, Royal Mail do things. The work we've done with Royal Mail is absolutely brilliant. I love working with Royal Mail. But people are starting to look at how these forward-thinking businesses are doing things and starting to see that maybe trying to find a resolution is a better option than more formal processes that maybe it leaves someone always wanting more. It leaves someone missing something. It doesn't resolve the issue, does it?
Absolutely. It's interesting. We've got people from Royal Mail on this webinar, so it's great to have you here today. And I remember when I met with Moya Green, the Chief Executive of Royal Mail, and also more recently when Jane Fairs, Head of Industrial and Employee Relations at Royal Mail, spoke on a case study that we did with CIPD. And it was clear from what Royal Mail was saying is this approach of resolution-focused and mediated approaches wasn't just a nice to have in terms of getting their employees working better again. It was a key strategic priority as part of their modernisation and privatisation strategy, and a recognition that within the industrial relations landscape, as well as within the psychological contract landscape and the grievance resolution, that a mediated approach was favourable to every other approach that existed within their organisations. And I remember hearing the head of the Unite Union speak at a big conference from Royal Mail Group, and he was very clear. Workplace investigations around grievances do nothing more than create further harm, anxiety and stress within those teams. And he was saying very loud and clear, mediation and the mediated approach is preferable in every single sense than the traditional approaches that were being currently used or preceded the work we did with Royal Mail Group. And that's not the only organisation who's starting to say this now.
And it's not only preferable for the organisation. What I found really surprising when I do mediations and when I first started doing mediations was it's preferable for the parties.
Yes,
they
absolutely.
find it massively, massively beneficial. And I don't think I leave a mediation where a party doesn't say, I finally see this other person as a human being now, and I can actually work with this person, and so they start to rebuild. But it's beneficial all round, I think.
Absolutely. So we'll look at how organisations are embedding this culture of resolution, how are they identifying the need for mediation. You know, if we're not measuring the effectiveness of our grievance procedure, one of the most important procedures that exists in our business is how we manage the interface between two or more people when they're in conflict. The grievance procedure exists to do that, yet it does not surprise me from the survey that we've run that the vast majority of organisations do not measure the efficacy of that procedure. No other part of the organisation would be subject to less scrutiny than the grievance procedure, and I would argue that that procedure is one of the most important processes to manage this interface between the parties. There is a paradox here between just treating it as business as usual and not measuring the effectiveness of it, and organisations measure the effectiveness of every single thing that they do. But why are they not measuring the effectiveness of one of the most important policies that exists within their business? I don't understand that. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this. Why don't we measure the effectiveness of the grievance procedure? Why don't we concern ourselves with the satisfaction rates of people who go through this process in the same way as we concern ourselves with the satisfaction rates of our employees in every aspect of our business? And what role is the triumvirate of managers, unions, HR professionals playing in the resolution process? My experience is they all have a key role to play, but they often pull in different directions, Elaine, pulling apart rather than pulling together. Sort of demonstrating and role modelling an understanding and appreciation of the issues, but a lack of cooperative methodology. And that then cascades down through the organisation. And dare I say it, in a great level of many grievances that I work with, the people's behaviour is mirroring the behaviour of the people elsewhere in the organisation. And I would go as far as to say that when it comes to grievances, we get the behaviours we deserve because we design the behaviours through our process.
That's very true. Yeah.
It's challenging, but I think it's something that's worth putting out there for people to think about. And here we have them. Our two warring parties. Look, they're shouting and screaming. You can imagine the anxiety levels, the cortisol, the adrenaline, that fight or flight response. It's all happening here in this image. And then we move into a resolution stage. No, we don't. I win, you lose. I'm right, you're wrong. Don't blame me. I don't trust you. You're a bully. I'll see you in court. It's all your fault. Negative, destructive. It becomes polarized. I'm right, you're wrong. I win, you lose. I attack, you defend. That becomes the language of the conflict, driven by our own psychology and our emotional responses, encouraged and perpetuated by an adversarial culture within our businesses. So the organisational culture, coupled with our psychological responses, play against the resolution and encourage this polarity, or what I would call a binary response to a conflict. Then, of course, some poor unsuspecting team leader or manager throws themselves at this and says, well, let's try and resolve it. And before we know it, within 30 seconds, one person's in tears and the other person's stormed out. It's because there's stuff going on in the conflict that we don't know about, because we're obsessed with behaviour. All we talk about in our organisations is behaviour, behaviour, behaviour. Our organisations have policies that address every single behaviour an employee could demonstrate. And what's the latest bad behaviour an employee can demonstrate? Going onto Twitter and saying bad things into social media. So we have a social media policy to mitigate and reduce the risk of that behaviour. Okay, so it's important to have these lines in the sand about what is and is not acceptable behaviour. But who's addressing the root cause of the behaviour? The root cause of conflict is much deeper than just the behaviours. In fact, the behaviours and the clash and the confrontation are just simply a symptom of a conflict. And if all we do is manage those behaviours, all we're doing is managing the symptom. And it's not that difficult to get beneath the surface. What do the parties need? To be respected, heard, taken seriously, to feel valued, to feel that they've got some sense of equality in the organisation. They have a stake, they've got skin in the game, they feel engaged. And when those needs aren't met, they experience often a profound sense of loss. And I'll talk more about that profound sense of loss, because that loss then drives these emotional and psychological response, the fight, flight, freeze or fall response. I'm either going to fight you, I'm just going to run away from it, I'll just fall over and yield, or I'm going to look like a rabbit in the headlights and freeze. Of course, as a mediator, I love the fifth F, flow. The fifth F of conflict, flow. A flow of dialogue, a flow of understanding, a flow of empathy. But if we don't have that flow, we have this air that forms, these interactions, these actions, interactions and reactions, the air of the conflict. And when I walk into an office where there's conflict, I can feel it in the air, because they can sense it, you can feel it, and people can see it. We see presenteeism, absence rates, attrition rates going up because of the air. And then we manage the behaviours. So when we're addressing a mediated approach or a mediation-friendly approach in the way that our managers and leaders work, as our HR professionals deliver their support, and as the unions are helping their members to engage in a resolution, what we need to do first and foremost is get underneath the surface of the conflict. And part of that is about language, helping the parties move away from the language of grievance, which is formal and it's adversarial. In fact, I was talking to an HR professional the other day, Elaine, and she was sharing with me her experience where someone said that they were going to, she picked up that the grieved party was going to go to HR and used going to HR as a threat. She was shocked, because she said, that's not why I came into the HR function. I was not in HR to be used as a threat. I'm there to act as an enabler, a strategic key player in the business to add value, to bring people issues to the fore and address them constructively. And of course, she believed that's what's her role. And if we look at the Orwick model, very much is the role of HR. But why is it then that so many employees say, I'll go to HR with this issue as though HR threat? And I think it becomes a real challenge for the human resources professional. And I think it's because they're the custodians of this procedure.
And not only that, human resources. The key word there is human. I think we become sort of parent figures almost. They assume that we will be able to deal with this and resolve it for them in the best possible way with as little damage to them as possible. And unfortunately, most of the time, all we can say is, do you want to make this formal or not?
Yeah.
That's all we can do. That's all our policies allow us to do. If you're not willing to take this formal, we can't really help you. And there is that risk sometimes of being worried about going through a facilitated discussion with two people and how that might end up if you don't actually have the skills you need to facilitate the conversation properly.
Absolutely. And when we were going through the survey data for that from the survey, over 75% of people on this webinar described the grievance procedure as lengthy and stressful.
It is.
And that is what is really interesting, and that's people's experience of the procedure. Now, it might work, it might not work, but it's lengthy and stressful. There must be a better way. Well, the word resolution, let's just put that word out there of resolution. It immediately brings up a future focus. It's not ignoring the fact that there are difficult issues to be resolved, but there's a certain informality to the language. It feels safer. I'm more likely to want to be able to talk with you about a shared goal, which is achieving a resolution, rather than slapping a grievance against you and proving that I'm better than you and I'm righter than you. That righteousness that we see coming through, it doesn't encourage that righteousness and that competitiveness. It's a much more cooperative term. It's collaborative in nature. It's about identifying and articulating our underlying interests and goals, our hopes, our fears, our aspirations, rather than about the blame. Now, when we're working in almost every aspect of dispute resolution as mediators, Elaine, one of the first things that we do is dig beneath the surface to understand three important things. How do you feel about the situation? What impact has the situation had on the other person and on your relationship? And what do you need going forward? How do you feel? What impact has it had and what do you need? And we'll be sat in a room, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock in the morning, talking to very upset, very aggrieved, very hurt, very damaged people. And they'll sit there and tell us what they need. And I'll go around to the room to the other person who's probably being dehumanized and turned into some kind of monster. And I'll say to them, so how do you feel? What impact has this had? What do you need? And this isn't going to come as a surprise to anyone on this webinar. What they say they need, what they say they feel is exactly the same as the person I've just left in the other room. So there isn't a gap, there isn't a schism, there isn't a division, there isn't a divide. The division, the divide, the schism and the gap is a perceived one, and it becomes worsened by the procedure. Well, this is crazy. The procedure that's there to resolve the issues worsens the problem. I wouldn't have that in my business, but it's the procedure of choice. The very same procedure that's there to resolve the issues makes matters worse. In 2015, I might be being slightly naive here, but that does not make sense. I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. I'm just throwing out some challenges today. That's all I want to do. Throwing out some challenges, getting us thinking a little bit more differently and challenging perhaps some of the norms and the status quo that we've accepted as being truisms and being right because we haven't necessarily evaluated on the surface what is really going on. And that's all I want to do today. Throw out some ideas, get us thinking differently, whether or not this lands with you and you're agreeing or disagreeing, well, you'll tell me in a moment in the survey, I guess. But, when they go wrong, uncertainty due to a loss of control, a fear, a loss of a sense of safety, suspicion, a loss of trust, stress, a loss of control. Martin Seligman, the famous psychologist, the founder of the School of Positive Psychology, tells us that a loss of control is a major driver of anxiety and stress for human beings. We can give people control back and grievances disempower and take control away. It goes on. So as a mediator, the focus for me is what the loss is and how do we rectify that. In many grievance procedures, it doesn't concern itself with that. And the end result is, this is just for managers, but I swear the managers are confused. And my job isn't about people management, that's an HR function. How many times have we heard that? Or that Peter principle, I was appointed as a manager because I'm a great accountant, I'm not about people. Of course it's about people. How can we, as managers, suggest that our role as managers and leaders isn't about people? Then there's this function called HR, which does the people stuff, and I do all the rest of it. It's not even 1970s; it's 1840s rhetoric. It's not right language, but I hear it all the time, and it's 2015. That can't be right.
No, I agree with you, and I'm sure people on the webinar will also agree that organisations are just absolutely full of managers who don't possess the skills they need to interact on that human level and intervene with people. They're usually appointed because they're good at the job, not necessarily because they are good with people and with a team. And that causes so many problems.
Absolutely. And here are just some of the further problems. And what's interesting, if we look at number 5 on the screen there, looking at increasing levels of dissatisfaction, attrition, litigation, unhappiness, discord, and other aspects around employee engagement and employee wellbeing, you already as an organisation are gathering the data relating to these issues. But when I go into an organisation and spend a day on site doing some mapping and doing a resolution audit to try and understand it, no one is pulling this data together to tell a story about conflict management. And it's still, less than 5% of organisations that I work with that I go into and they're gathering this data as part of their narrative. And for me, one of the biggest pieces of advice I could give to anyone on this webinar is start measuring the impact of conflict and understanding, the challenges that you're facing. So let's start off with our first poll. So the first poll is simply asking, is your current grievance procedure effective at resolving disputes? But bear in mind the word here is resolving disputes. It's getting the parties to a point of resolution. It's not about a perception of procedural fairness. It's about resolution. So over to yourselves. Is your policy effective at resolving the issues? Okay, so the figures are coming in. We have nearly 50% voted. We'll keep the poll open for a little while longer. 71. Okay, so 5. If you haven't voted yet, now's your opportunity to do so. 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. Thank you very, very much for that. So I'm going to put the screen share up now of the poll results. You should see that on your screen. Let me check. Yes, you can see the poll on your screen now. So 63% of you are saying that the procedure isn't effective at resolving disputes. 37% of you are saying that it is. That's fantastic. I'd love to hear from both of you. If no, why not? If your procedure is working well and it's resolving issues, what are you doing in your procedure? What is working for you? Do you have mediation in your procedure, or have you got other approaches? Love to hear from you. Please share your thoughts through the questions panel or ask questions. We'll read those out and we'll share those reflections through the webinar and also as part of the recording afterwards. So please do share those. But clearly, the vast majority of you on this webinar are suggesting that your grievance procedure isn't effective at resolving disputes. So here's some questions for you to take away from the webinar, and we'll send these through, so I'm not going to spend too long on this, but these are just some questions that I would be asking myself. Am I resolution ready? Is my organisation ready to embrace resolution? So does mediation feature as a strategic priority? What is the real cost of conflict? How many sick days? What's the cost of a conflict in terms of attendance? How many grievances do you get? How much do they cost you? Settlement agreements, payments. What kind of impact does it have on your engagement, satisfaction levels? Do you ask the question as part of your engagement or pulse tests? How much management time is spent on these issues? Is it impacted on your customer experience? Certainly, if we look at the Freedom to Speak Up review from Robert Francis QC, following on from the mid-staffs inquiry and the Keogh review, there was a direct correlation between conflict, bullying in the workplace within the NHS and patient mortality. That is a stark reality for organisations within the NHS. The customer experience was simple. If you were working in an NHS trust where there are high levels of conflict, you had a greater tendency to die as a result of going out. And that is something which the NHS, and particularly the Freedom to Speak Up review, is seeking to challenge, because that is not a relationship, a situation that can continue. And do we train our managers and our leaders to spot issues and nip them in the bud? So Rachel, you've asked a question here. Even when managers understand the cost of conflict, they would still rather hand it over to someone else because they are task delivery focused and feel that it takes too much time. What do you find is the biggest tool to leverage to get them to engage, to build their skills and confidence? Fantastic question. Quite a complex question, Rachel, as well, because there's a lot to it. But for me, it's about value add. It's about demonstrating that sitting down in the room with two parties in a difficult situation will add value to your relationship and also to your business. And I'll give you an example. Let's imagine that I've got two people in a department whose productivity is dropping because they're in conflict. One person is producing reports that are substandard, they're not communicating effectively with their colleague is increasingly isolating themselves from the team, and the manager is trying to resolve this issue. In my vision, a manager would sit down with these parties and have a facilitated conversation. In the first instance, letting them talk about the relationship. Let's skip through the relationship issues because we're going to come back to those. But let's then say that party B, who's not performing so well, who's producing reports that are substandard, is getting information sent through to them on an Excel spreadsheet on a Thursday to produce a report for a Friday. Now, it turns out that the other person sat on that information on a Tuesday. They could actually produce the report much earlier, but they don't know that because they've never been asked. So the stressor in the relationship is the communication breakdown between the two of them. But actually what the manager is able to do is to tease out and identify that there are systemic issues in the way that they work together that could be fixed in terms of the flow of information. Now, that manager could go out and spend £1,000 on a Lean Six Sigma guru black belt management consultant to come in and do some business process, Lean Six Sigma, Scrum type stuff. Or they could get the two people in their team who are experiencing a breakdown in the systems and experiencing conflict to come together, and they'll tell the manager what isn't working. And this is then a driver of innovation. Increased performance, increased productivity, increased opportunity for innovation. Now the manager is adding value and achieving their KPIs. And this is where the conversation becomes far more powerful and far more enriching for the manager. So yes, it's about the relationship, but it's not the relationship just for the sole purpose of having two happy people in the team skipping through the meadows singing Kumbaya. That's not what this is about. This is about delivering hard business outcomes and ensuring that our tribunal, and by the way, it's really important to stress here, Rachel, as well, the manager isn't on their own. And we have this, is it a manager's responsibility, HR's responsibility, union's responsibility, board's responsibility? And this kind of hierarchy that exists within our organisations, or, you know, as we maybe call it, passing the hot potato or putting the monkey on the other person's shoulders, that actually masks a more complex and more sophisticated paradigm that needs to exist, where these players are working collaboratively. So of course the manager should be able to access support from HR, who should be able to access support from the unions, who should be able to have a level of engagement with the board in terms of linking in with the values and the strategy of the business. And one of the issues we face in terms of grievance resolution is we almost compartmentalise who plays what role in that process, instead of developing a collaborative methodology in the business where everybody has a responsibility to support a resolution. So the question, Rachel, to those people in HR is, when that manager is going into the room to bring these two people together, what support and resources does the organisation do to wrap that manager up, to support the parties, to support the manager, and give them the best opportunity of having a constructive conversation? Because the manager is scared of two things, excuse my crudeness there, snot and tears. And the issue for snot and tears is bodily fluid leaking from people's faces generates two problems in the eyes of the manager. The first one is they don't know how to deal with those issues when they arise, those strong feelings, so they're better off not to ask the question. But secondly, and worse, is they perceive that then is the starting point for a grievance being raised, not against each other, but no, against me, the manager. Mm-hmm. So I'm now putting myself at risk because the organisation has a grievance procedure which is intrinsically adversarial and encourages blame. So surely it's better for me as a manager to stick my head in the sand, avoid dealing with the topics, not have to deal with the snot and tears of conflict, but also not put myself at risk of being called a bully, which is a career-defining allegation to have thrown against the manager, particularly if they're fairly new in their role.
Or favouritism and choosing sides. But also, Rachel, what I find quite often is that these managers themselves are involved in a conflict. And if they can't deal with that conflict that they are personally involved in, their confidence actually takes a massive knock. So when two people around them are in conflict and they don't know how to handle that, that also doesn't help. It's very much a confidence thing. They're too scared, they're too afraid, they don't have the right tools to actually go in there and resolve the issue, or they feel they don't.
Absolutely.
They do have it, they just don't know it yet.
That's exactly right. You don't need to go on an MBA. I've been on an MBA. No one taught me on my MBA how to manage workplace conflicts. Disappointing, as in, you can be assured we're working with business schools to try and change that. But you haven't got to go on an MBA to go and learn how to develop some of these basic questioning skills, assertiveness skills, reframing skills, active listening, and of course the ability to be empathetic. And one of the other aspects that I think is really valuable in mediation, Elena, I know you share this view, is the power of empathy. When we are in a conflict and we're locked down, boom, bang, sides, division, camps, the ability to put yourself in the other person's shoes vanishes. We engage in an empathy deficit situation. Now, when the manager asks the parties to put themselves into each other's shoes, very quickly, through the use of empathy and emotional intelligence, do we start to see the parties close that gap. And it's through that empathy, and for me, when I work with people in conflict, there's an absence of empathy. Question: how many times does the word empathy feature in your grievance procedure? If it doesn't feature, maybe there's an opportunity to say, could it feature? And within the resolution policy, it runs through the resolution policy like Blackpool runs through a rock. It's all about empathy and closing the empathy deficit. Andy, thank you for your question. An issue that we have is that we have great managers. Sadly, though, they are not always great leaders, and there is a huge difference between the two. This is a really interesting question. You know, there's much out on LinkedIn, and there's an enormous amount of literature between the manager. What's the difference between a manager and a leader? And I think you've hit the nail on the head there. There are big differences. But for me, we all act in a leadership capacity at some time. And perhaps if we look at the management of conflict, it's an opportunity for us to demonstrate our leadership. And I could be working with a new recruit into a new management role. I've done that. I remember doing a lot of coaching in the police, newly recruited sergeants in the police or acting sergeants who were suddenly given a sergeant's badge, but we used to go in and doing the house raids and, nicking whoever their customer was from the front. And we had to work with them to help them understand that actually their role as a leader was very different, was to lead the team, and it required a different level of leadership. And we used mediation skills and these kind of negotiation and skills and active listening skills to help those new sergeants understand their role as managers and also as leaders. So conflict management can pull those two together. And I've written on this topic many times, Andy. I've got a lot of blogs on my LinkedIn post about this topic of leadership and management. But let's move on, conscious of time, and we love talking about this, and I realise that time never is on our side, and so we need to move on. But if you've got questions, please do put them through. A number of you have asked, we'll get a copy of this presentation, will you get a copy of the documentation? Absolutely, we'll get this out to you after the session. We'll send out the slide deck, we'll send out the transcription, we'll send out the video. That's going to be a few days, probably after the weekend, but certainly the slide deck and the model resolution policy can come out to you today. There's no problems at all about that. So here we are, the model resolution policy. Doesn't it look lovely? Mm-hmm. This is where it's at. This is about changing the focus, a new approach for resolving disputes, a new approach for developing constructive relationships, and a new approach for encouraging positive conversations at work. I launched this at the Law Society 2 years ago, and the room was packed. Airlines, banks, retailers, Whitehall departments were all there, crammed in, saying that please show me another way. Let's talk about the other way. So what is different? What makes it different? Well, on one level, it's a new language. It's a new way of approaching it. Now, it's very much, for those of you who are worried, does it follow the minimum standards on ACAS code on discipline and grievance? ACAS are fully aware of the procedure, and their position is, and the position of the employment tribunals, and I've heard employment tribunal judges say this, is it doesn't matter what you call it. You can call it whatever you wish. So long as you follow the minimum standards and you're compliant with the ACAS code. And what does that mean? That you have the opportunity to have a formal meeting with the employee who has the right to representation, and there is a right of appeal, whatever the outcome is. And of course, the resolution policy more than deals with that. So let's deal with the ACAS code on discipline and grievance, park that because it's done. But this is so much more than that. So it meets those minimum standards. It's a new approach. It's values-based and person-centered. And when I go into organisations, big organisations, and I look at the values on the reception room, the annual report, the values, respect, customer excellence, diversity, dignity at work, all of those wonderful values. I don't see anywhere, let's beat each other up and drag each other through a head backwards through a grievance mechanism. That doesn't feature in the values. There's a disconnect between the values and the procedure. So it's tying those two together. There's an enhanced triage of cases. So we've trained the entire Lloyds Bank HR Shared Service Centre in resolution triage. So they're identifying routes to resolution at a much earlier stage. Mediation is absolutely ubiquitous through the procedure. It's still voluntary, but there's a clear expectation that your employees will give due consideration to get into a room with each other. It's not acceptable to go, would you be willing to mediate? No, they're a bully. And then the organisation says, oh, fair enough, I'll go and spend thousands of pounds on an investigation, which isn't going to achieve anything. Surely, if mediation is as successful as it is, and within the Royal Mail Group, within the first 6 months, 100% of cases of bullying that went to mediation were successfully resolved. Surely there's a greater focus, has to be a good thing. But it also includes practical toolkits for HR professionals, for managers, for employees, and also for unions, for their representatives. It promotes and encourages these relationships and constructive dialogue. It's about leaders and managers walking the talk, going back to the point we were talking about, Andy, role modelling. And I don't think the gap between leadership and management is that great. We've maybe got a little bit scared by the amount of literature out there telling us that these things are very different. For me, you can be a great manager and a great leader simply by saying, good morning, team. How's everyone doing? Thank you for your amazing efforts yesterday. I haven't got to go on again an MBA or read the latest guru on leadership to know how to say thank you to a team. And I haven't got to be able to read a 500-word tome on leadership methodologies to know if my team's in a difficult place that I'm going to give them some time and a space to talk it through. We overcomplicate things. We make things too difficult, too processy, too academic. Let's get back to basics. Let's get in a room and talk about it. So it's about fairness, respect, empathy, dignity. Now, these policies are enshrined in the framework, but they are also enshrined in the progressive business. And if they're not, then that business, I think, would struggle. Now, what business would have as a value bullying people out of the business, accepting high levels of attrition, the absence rates of 10% or whatever are unacceptable on the P&L. They're clearly not. So Siobhan, we've had a question from you. So gosh, it's a long question. So we're going to need to come back to that, Siobhan. Thank you very much. You've asked us a very, very detailed question there. So let us come back and read that while we're presenting. So Elaine, are you okay kind of looking through the question and seeing if you can respond to it? Thank you, Siobhan. We'll try and come to your question in a moment. So what does it actually look like? Well, it's a very basic flow of activity. I talked about flow earlier, so it's about flow. So the issue will be raised and assessment will be undertaken by a manager, HR, or indeed the unit. So I set up the Islington Council issues resolution policy. In fact, I'm going up to Islington Council after this webinar to go and work with their resolution managers. What a wonderful title. Resolution managers and mediators in readiness for the launch of their resolution policy and mediation programme on the 1st of January 2016. So this model has been adopted by this large London-based local authority, by large banks, but it's in place now in a great number of organisations. So someone looks at the case, a resolution is raised, so a grievance, a resolution or a request for resolution is raised, someone looks at it and says, actually the most effective way of resolving this is X, Y or Z. Biasing towards an early resolution or an informal intervention, a resolution meeting with the employee, a facilitated conversation driven by an HR professional, and this is where it works fantastically well within Royal Mail. The unions and the management work together to facilitate a dialogue. So imagine this, the union and the HR professional facilitating a conversation between our two parties. Or maybe having access to a team of internal mediators like Transport for London and Marks and Spencer's. Or you might need someone outside of the organisation because there may be a discrimination element to it. It might be about a homophobic issue, a bullying, a transgender issue. There may be a protected characteristic that you'd really like someone who's outside of the business to be able to come in and really explore and understand in more detail. If, however, your perception is it's too serious and requires a formal response, then of course there's the opportunity to move it through a formal resolution. That may be preceded by a meeting between you and the aggrieved party, of course, and their representative, and then a formal investigation to establish the facts. We train investigators, but what's absolutely key here is the investigators know how to stop the investigation to allow mediation to happen if it's felt that at some point the party's best interest is served by getting into a room with each other. And of course, what we're able to do is measure the effectiveness of this. Within organisations, we're starting to see 25, 30, 35, 40+% of issues are now being resolved through a mediated approach at the earliest stage. There's cost savings within BT. When we did the work with BT, this is a number of years ago now, Caroline Walters, who's left the organisation now, reported £1 million worth of savings in the first 12 months of BT using mediation. Royal Mail's figures, which were reported in the recent case study, are equally as high. An ACAS report into an NHS trust who used mediation, Northumbria Healthcare NHS Trust, again reported not those kind of £1 million savings, but tens or hundreds of thousands of pounds. It's not just about the nice, happy relationship, it's about the business. So for employees to make it work, they need to be willing to engage, but they're signing up to work for your organisation. If your values are about resolving issues and they've chosen to work for you, it's reasonable expectation that your employees will engage. It's not reasonable just to rule out getting in a room with each other because I'm scared because they're a bully. You're bound to say that because you don't like them, you're in conflict. You couldn't trust them as far as you could throw them. How can you expect me to sit down in a room with them? You're bound to say that you're in conflict. It's not a reasonable response to being offered mediation, and it certainly shouldn't be a response that the organisation says, fair enough, we'll now investigate. I don't think that's acceptable. So engaging early on, we need to listen to their concerns and help them to articulate them. But at the end of the day, the vast majority of disputes are better off resolved around the table. A diplomatic remedy, as we would apply if we're looking at the Syrian conflict. That's the same methodology in organisations, a diplomatic response. So the HR team is providing and coordinating this function, and for the manager, actually engaging in the process, supporting it, fostering that culture where people are able to resolve issues and walking the talk. So again, I'm conscious of time, but what I'd like to do very quickly, if I can, is just look through some of the approaches that are embedded in the scheme and then just spend a moment talking about mediation. We run a lot of webinars and workshops. I run a free workshop called a Mediation Eye-Opener. It's on the last Friday of every month. We run them in Birmingham and in London and all around the country. if you're interested in coming to one of my free mediation workshops, let Jenny know after the event. We'll book you on. We run webinars on mediation. So I'm only going to do a very cursory glance at mediation, but if you're interested, and of course, what we love doing is coming to your organisations and talking this about with your stakeholders, your unions, your HR colleagues, your leaders, about how to make mediation work. But these are the approaches that can be used, a wide array of approaches, all of which interact with each other and are very, very effective. But the primary methodology is the mediation approach. So it's a non-adversarial way of resolving issues. The mediator is there to act as a neutral third party to help the parties collaborate and cooperate rather than blaming each other. And what differentiates mediation from every other form of justice is that it's not the authority figure who determines an outcome, it's the parties themselves who identify it and implement it. So the mediator doesn't judge or blame or tell people what they should do. Mediation remains voluntary and it's confidential. But as I've already indicated, we can do a lot more to help the parties subscribe. And here we have a mediation, a classic mediation room. The mediator there is sat with our two parties, bringing them together. That's what a mediation looks like. Some people are scared of that, but it's nothing more or nothing less than what you've got there in front of you on the screen. Of course, as I said, we go through that in much more detail when we're running our events. Huge benefits, Elaine. Real benefits, engagement and well-being, cost benefits, goodwill, and we start to see the time and the costs of conflict start to reduce.
I like that, management and HR time saving.
Yeah. Well, you can't get it back, can you? You can't. No. You cannot. That day you just spent dealing with that issue, that grievance that's sat on your desk right now that you've just spent yesterday going through, you're never going to get that day back.
I've got enough to do.
It's gone.
It's a nightmare.
Mediation happens in one full day. 93% of all cases that we mediate are successfully resolved in one full day.
Well, that's the point I just wanted to quickly raise, David, is that people might be asking, well, what's the difference between a facilitated conversation and a mediation? And the difference is vast. Absolutely. To be honest, mediation takes a whole day.
Yeah. But a facilitated conversation can be much quicker. So we're coming to the end of the session, conscious that I've taken advantage of your time today, which I apologise for, but I hope you found it useful. So would you be interested, willing to consider a resolution policy? Have I persuaded you that perhaps it's time to think differently and to change the vernacular of our business? So we're going to keep the poll open for another 5 seconds. That's 65% of you voted. That's 4, 3, 2, 1. If you haven't voted, now's your opportunity. I can see people are still voting. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now, and I'm going to share the poll results with you. Fantastic. Well, this is a very, very clear message, I think, Elaine. 94% of you on the poll today, and this poll, this webinar incorporates HR directors, senior decision makers, business leaders. The people on this webinar are key decision makers within their organisations, within your organisations, and you're saying loud and clear, the time for change has come. 94% of organisations here are saying there has to be a better way. So I hope the resolution policy fulfills that. We're here as a small business. We do some fantastic work. We've got some amazing accolades and case studies on our website. I've got a most incredible team, of whom Elaine is one of those. So Elaine, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your thoughts and experiences. It's been great to have you here. It's been great having you on the webinar. This is what we do. If you've got a case on your desk, pass it to us. We'll solve it. We'll fix it for you. That's what we do. We can come in and sort it out.
And from the questions, I can tell there are a few people who have raised the issue that management might, don't have the tools they necessarily need. Well, we do really, really good management training. I love training the managers, I really do. It's such an eye-opener, and to see their faces light up when they learn all these different tools and techniques. So keep that in mind as well. It's well worth investing in.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. So we set up mediation programs like Royal Mail and Northumbria Healthcare, NHS Trust and Marks & Spencer's. We deliver accredited mediation training, the National Certificate in Workplace Mediation. If you'd like to be a mediator, talk to us. We provide that training all over the country, and we also come on site to deliver that training to groups from 6 to 60. It doesn't matter. It's outstanding. We provide conflicts audits and diagnosis. Do you want to know how much conflict costs you? We can help you to identify that. And as Lane's rightly said, our Leaders 2020 programme is specifically about delivering those skills. Now, some people say soft skills, but they're not soft skills.
No,
they're hard skills.
They're hard skills.
But, you know, there's a report, if you've not seen it, the McDonald's Back in Soft Skills report that was published back in January this year. I'm still showing, thank you very much for pointing out, I'm still showing the survey. For those of you who've not seen it, the Back in Soft Skills report, supported by so many organisations, published by McDonald's back in January, February this year, worth a look because it's putting soft skills back on the radar. These are hard skills. So thank you very much. There's been a lot more questions, but I'm conscious of time. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to keep the webinar recording now. So I'm going to answer these questions that have been posed. So I'm going to keep this recording. They'll then be picked up in the transcription and also the recording. But I'm going to end it for those of you who need to get back to your day job. If you want to stay on the webinar, you'd be very welcome to stay on now. But for those of you who can't stay on, please do track me down on LinkedIn. Like I say, I'm about to publish a big post today on negotiation skills and how they're valuable for career success. So, you know, I do put a lot onto LinkedIn, as Elaine does. You published a piece recently on James Bond and investigation skills. It was a great blog, Elaine. So if you can stay on, please do. For those of you who can't, thank you so much. We'll get the policy over to you. Thank you for joining us, and I will wish you a very, is it okay to happy weekend? We're nearly at the weekend.
Nearly, happy weekend.
Happy weekend. Thank you. Okay, so I can see some people are signing out. We've got a lot of people signing out, but for those of you who can stay on the webinar, we've had some really interesting questions. So let's just look through these questions that we've got. So here's the one from Siobhan. Let me just increase the screen size there a bit, Elaine. In our grievance procedure, we often use mediation. For example, we recently had a case in which a group grievance was raised against the team lead. By using mediation, the employees and team lead could have had a fairly formal chat about how they felt, why they feel that way, and what actions could be taken to make the situation better. And this worked a treat. It improved the relationship between them all and gave them all the chance to explain how they feel and to discuss anything that was on their minds. However, we also have had a lot of situations in which employees raise a grievance against their manager if they are not happy with the decision that the manager has made, resulting in the manager's confidence being knocked and left feeling like they are stepping on eggshells around their team. This has caused a lot of problems for this site as the manager lacks the confidence to discipline the employees and their team. Siobhan, it's a really great question and an observation. Thank you very much for that. I think what's really important there is to recognise that, you know, again, it's the term grievance. Raising a grievance puts our teeth on edge. Because if someone takes a grievance out against you, the first response is, well, it's not fair, it's not right. It can result in a dismissal. You probably want to get me dismissed. And what's the first reaction when this thing happens? Is defensiveness. Now, and when we hold our managers up on a pedestal, you can't be defensive. You have to be, you know, better than everyone else. Professional. But of course they feel defensive. And what's the best form of defense? Attack or withdraw. So we get this complex psychological and emotional reaction that's playing out for both the manager, which then plays out as a lack of confidence. And what happens often is no one's supporting the manager and the employees to say, look, this is not going to help you identify a resolution. How can we work towards a resolution that's going to benefit everybody and break that cycle of defend and attack, win and lose? And until we break that cycle, you will have great examples like you've shared where a team have engaged with those, but there'll be more examples where there's been dysfunction, people have left, the manager, just a great manager, someone who was on their career ascendancy, basically gives up, leaves, or just basically says, okay, well, I've had enough of being a manager. In fact, I was working with some senior leaders recently, and one of the senior leaders said that management of conflict was holding back their career aspirations because they were not willing to apply to the next level of management because of the levels of conflict that would have to resolve. It's very interesting. So I think for an organisation, it's about having empathy with those managers and taking that word grievance out and finding another vernacular and terminology that's much more acceptable to all of the parties.
When we actually train managers, David, what we also do, as you are aware, is we prepare them for the eventuality. We teach them communication techniques.
Yes.
But a very clever, if I say so myself, part that we do train them is what kind of bombs might be thrown your way. And that sounds a bit emotive, but we have a very large group discussion with these managers where we talk about how do you receive criticism? What communication tools can you actually use that when you receive this criticism, that you react in a professional, adult way instead of, for instance, the fight or flight way. So we try to arm them with the right tools to be able to do that, and it's very effective.
There's non-defensive responses.
Non-defensive, yes.
That's fantastic. Another question, great question from Yasmin. Yasmin was basically saying, what about if the issue is of sexual harassment and the person making the complaint would struggle to face the alleged perpetrator? Very, very powerful. So when we're talking about harassment of this kind, one has to be very sensitive and compassionate to both the victim, but also the person who's had the allegations made against them, because these are career-defining issues. Let's not beat around the bush. If you're having these allegations made against you, it can define your career. So we have to be very careful. So we would never just jump in and mediate. We would always work cooperatively with the organisation, with the individuals concerned. However, I have a story from when I was a young mediator. I'm still young, so a younger mediator, where I was asked to mediate between the two families. One family, the young girl had been murdered by the other family's son, and then he'd subsequently gone and jumped off a bridge and killed himself late at night that same evening. So the family liaison officers working with the families, and suddenly there were issues that were arised within that relationship, between the families. There was a standoff in the cemetery one day, and also the young boy's shrine was desecrated twice, the shrine that had been put above the bridge where he killed himself. And I was asked to mediate between these two families alone. And I said, okay, well, we'll give it a go. It's not going to be easy, but we gave it a go. So we worked with the family liaison officers, we worked with the families, and we spent weeks getting to know them and for them to build trust with us. And then we spent a day with them in a hotel in Leicestershire, brought them all together with the family liaison officers, the mother, the father of both sides. And I remember very, very vividly that in particular the mother of the young girl was unlawfully killed. And this was prior to the inquest as well. So I was asked to come in because they were worried about there being a big issue at the inquest, a big issue. So I remember the mother was very unhappy about being asked to mediate. As far as she was concerned, this other family had spawned the devil incarnate, and she could not understand in any way that they'd experienced a loss. But without having to get into all of the technical details of how I mediated that, at the end of it, the mother of the daughter came in and acknowledged the loss of the other mother. And it was very powerful and very profound. You can't convey it meaningfully in a webinar like this. But it was very powerful. And then on the day of the inquest, on the front page of the local newspaper, the father and the mother both acknowledged the loss of the other family. And in that acknowledgement of loss was a coming together that could not have ever happened had those two people not had the courage, those two families had not had the courage to get in a room with each other. And you know what I thought then, Elaine? If they can do it, anyone can. Now, I'm not trivialising the complexity and the impact of these difficult things in the workplace, and believe me, I'm not. And I've seen the harm and damage that they cause. However, I believe passionately that the best way to address these issues is courageously and confidently. And mediation can and does work in these serious issues. It's not just for the low-level quarrelsome people. It's a powerful.
It is. It
driver of transformation.
It definitely helps with the lower level as well. But what's also very that's again the difference between a mediation and a facilitated conversation. We spend a lot of time supporting these people who are very vulnerable. For instance, if they've been through sexual harassment, we make no bones about it, and we support them throughout the day. And that's why it's different from a facilitated conversation, because we have the training and the skills to carry them through it.
Well, look, thank you so much again. We've had some wonderful feedback, so really it's clearly had a very positive effect today. Very good feedback from everyone. Looking forward to carrying on the conversation. Let's have a conversation about conflict, a dialogue about disputes, and we look forward to having that. So for those of you who were able to hang on for the last sort of 5 minutes, I hope that's been a useful insight. Thank you once again, and looking forward to working with you in the future. Take care. Thank you. Bye.